Probably notice I've got a few items on the table here that would be of interest for you for painting. You'll notice some new items and some old ones. There's a little bit of Scotchman in me, so I reuse a lot of things a lot of times. Painting, I find if you buy cheap products, the job never turns out the way it should. Spend the money on a decent paintbrush that comes with a jacket. Once the jacket falls apart, that's the best way to keep a paintbrush. If you notice, that's an older brush. It's a sash brush. It's been used, and once it's clean and it holds its shape. If you wrap it in the newspaper when it's damp, once you've cleaned it, it's the way that they'll keep their form. That way when you go to reuse it, you don't end up trying to paint with a horse's tail where everything's sticking every direction on you. I have brushes like this that are done for siding. That's probably a 15-year-old paintbrush, but it costs you a fair bit of money for them. The different types of brushes that you use for different applications. If I was to be staining a deck, that's what I would be using. It's a natural hair brush. It's not a synthetic. If I'm doing something interior painting, I always use a sash brush. The sash brush is an angle cut like this. And it's very easy to cut because the brush bristles will lay a certain direction. And I'll use a synthetic brush with the latex paints. But you'll find something like this if you just pass it around. It's I think I can't remember if the price is on that. Somewhere close to $15 to $20, some of the better brushes. I have some that are, I don't have one here, but some of them can get fairly pricey when you get into the wider ones. But you'll find it makes, especially when you're doing drywall and stuff at home, very easy if you buy a proper brush for the job. If you're painting something like siding on a home too, you'll want a broader brush, a little thicker so that it carries a little more paint. There's nothing worse than just trying to paint and you're ending up going like this to get material on. You want a brush that'll carry a fair bit of materials so that when you're painting, longer strokes. You use the brush strokes, you'll get a nice smooth even finish if you're using longer strokes on it, and that you'll notice that once I show you on the wall. There are some applications where a cheaper brush like this, I find if I'm doing foundation work like painting on the foundations, I'll just buy a cheap brush because it just destroys them if you're painting on concrete. Some of them from the dollar store might be appropriate, but I think something of a brand name brush, like this is a Sims, and you'll find even for a cheaper brush, it's a fairly good quality brush. If you go to a paint store and you have a particular project that you're doing, ask the people at the paint store for the appropriate product. You'll find they're a world of knowledge. There's always things new coming out. I've been used to using certain products through my career and have stuck with them because I know how they work and react. But it may work differently for you if you get a newer product or something that they've come up with that's better than what I've done. So there's a world of knowledge there that you can tap into. And if it's something that you've got a problem with, people at the paint store can usually help you. If you've got something like blistering on a wall, snap a few pictures like you did with your door there to show me. Everybody's got a cell phone. Everybody's got the capability of snapping a few quick pictures. You can go to a help desk at the paint store. They can give you suggestions to repair these things. and then you're buying the appropriate product. You can go to Walmart and places like that if you've researched it a little bit yourself. Every different grade of product has a price break, and depending on what you're trying to do, decide where you want to be at that price break. If it's what you can afford, that's fine. Painting's the one thing that in a home everybody sees. Being a real estate agent, what's the first thing when you walk in a home and look around? The layout is fine, but you look at the walls, you look at the ceilings, you look to see what condition of the paint is in the home. Was it slap happily put on and the job looks like heck? I've seen paint in homes where you could throw a sweater and it'll hang on the wall because all of the garbage from people painting, they've never sanded between coats. Adamantly sand between coats. It takes nothing. And I don't mean sand till you rub the, I'll show you on the wall after that I've sanded certain areas and you can run your hand along it, and as soon as you touch the area that hasn't been sanded, it's coarse. There's little bits of dust, and lint off of a roller is the worst thing that you can get. It's paint. If you have a paint that's got skins on it, it's sat for too long in the tray. You dip your roller and you run it on the wall and there's little gobs of stuff stuck on the wall. Stick your finger out and pull it off and then re-roll the wall. That's the most annoying thing, and if it dries and goes hard, you'll be there with a razor blade taking it off because they do not sand off properly. If you're painting along baseboards and that, if you ever needed to remove them, that's a good little bar for popping them off. They're quite inexpensive. What did you pay the other day for that? Yep, but you can tap on the backside, use it as a lever, pop them off. Just a little pry bar. These are actually sold as a scraper, but because of the sharp edge, they fit into the baseboards quite nicely. Or if you're popping casing off around the door and you don't want to damage the paper around the edge, take your utility knife and just cut down the edges. Because of being painted, it will stick to the paper. So if you go to pull that product off, it'll tear the paper on the drywall, and then you're back with the drywall filler and your drywall knives, and away you go. I went through my box and I had told you to go and look at a wider drywall knife. That one was $11. You know, it's a good broad knife. Richard makes, you'll notice most of mine are Richard. They're used by most of the people in the trades. They're a good quality knife. There are others. These are Task. They're sold by quite a few other jobber companies. Lumberyards sell this predominantly. That one was under $10. So when I said you go to a wider knife and that when you're doing patching on walls and you're trying to cover it in, that's a fairly inexpensive. Works great as a dustpan too if you want to sweep up stuff. I use that all the time. I told you about the sanding sponges and the different quality of them. This one's fairly dusty and that. If you look at the edges on these, this one is nice and square for doing edges and that. This one you'll find the edges hang over. You'll back cut the edges when you sand them. So if you actually look at those, you'll see what I meant by buying them. They come in all different sizes and shapes. And as you notice, I never throw them out. There's all. I usually buy the fine mediums. I don't like the real coarse ones because they're too coarse aggregate. I find after they're worn down in that, I use things like this for doing lacquer on woodwork. Because it's worn almost smooth, it leaves you with just a satin smooth finish. So if you're doing your oak trim or cabinet doors and such, these work fine. You won't have the severe sanding scratches that you'll have for a new one. They get into contours nicely. If you're doing edges in a corner, you've taped some drywall like we have here, and you need to get a nice square edge, that's where I use the blue sanding sponge that's there. I believe I picked it up at Glidden. Like I say, there's different quality of them. And as you'll find, if you go to do the job with a poor one and you sand away in the corner, now all of a sudden you've got big grooves from that sponge, you back patching again so that you're happy with the finish. Because as soon as you put the paint on it, the primer, you'll notice those scratches from the poorer one. I use that other one for a different purpose. Stainless steel sinks, if you get them where they look dull and all scratched up, if you take that sponge and you do this with it, it looks like a brand new sink. If you're selling the house, that's a good way to trim up the sink. Stainless steel sinks don't have a finish sprayed on them, so if they're marked up or kind of grungy looking, you just take this and the caulking guns, there hasn't been a good one made, I don't think, in 50 years. They have a tendency to work for so long, and then all of a sudden there's just some piece in them breaks and they go. So I've probably got a dozen around home of different. I use these in the larger ones. The real cheap ones can be a Bearcat to use for ladies and that, something like this that's levered. It's a little easier to use and control. The old clicker style ones, you've got to have a grip like a grizzly bear if you've got a heavy caulking or glue that you're using with them. I use DAP bathtub caulk sometimes. It's in just a tube. If you've got small jobs around the home, they can be good for that. You cut just a small angled hole and put it on, and the old run your finger along. If you're doing a bathtub or around a tub surround or something like that, I like to mask a line, because you ever get where you put caulking on it, it all ends up all over. If you just take, they sell a couple of these, I don't have one with me, little plastic knives that work. You put a straight edge of just painter's tape on each surface and you put it in, and then you run the edge down it and then just lift the tape off gently. You end up with nice straight lines all the way around on them. Painter's tape can be your best friend. Pick something like these. There's a good product on the market now called Frog's tape. It's a little more money. It doesn't bleed near as bad under the edges of the tape and comes off. Don't leave these products on if you've painted, because what happens then is the paint adheres to this, and as you peel it off, it tears off the work you've done. It's fine to leave it for an hour or two after you've painted, but don't leave it overnight. Try and take it off. If you're trying to mask off around your home for painting, don't put regular masking tape on it. You'll find it'll tear off bits and pieces of your painted wall if it's primed and you're doing work onto the lift paper and stuff, and you'll end up patching. It's just a little bit too much adhesive for that application. Painter's tape comes in a myriad of widths, I think right up to 6-inch sometimes if you want. Paint stores have good selections of the widths of them. You can get them right down to narrow. A few things that I use for rollers. I've got different ones. The average for a wall for most homes, I use a 10 mil roller. You'll find I use, this one's been used. I've got one that's in my paint tray here. This roller is practically wore out, but it's my sweetheart. It doesn't drop lint. It'll be like most women wish their husband was, not dropping things behind them all the time. This, I find if you're going to prime the wall, use your new roller. Wash it out, clean it up, and then reuse it for the finish coats. You'll find you'll have a lot less lint and things that catch onto the wall after. Once I've got a roller, if I take a new one out of the package, I'll put it in and go roll a closet or something. Find an area that's behind a door, somewhere where the lint and that isn't going to be as noticeable if you do happen to walk away and not notice it. For cleaning them, wash in a sink until you've got relatively all of the stuff out. Run all of the moisture you can off. I usually will either clean a sleeve, put it back on this, and find an old piece of plywood or drywall scrap that I've got around, and then run the roller up and down it, and it takes the moisture out of it. If you do an awful lot of painting in that, a good investment's a spinner. You take your roller and you put it on, you go to your garbage can, stick it in, and it spins all the moisture out of it. These are a Bearcat to use some days, but you can take your brush, and they're designed. You stick the brush down in, and it dries all of the bristles and that from your brush. You block it back in your paper, put it in your box. I always keep a box in the garage that's got all my painting stuff in it. You'll find I'm anal about putting all of these things away in a certain order so they all lay straight. You don't want a brush that's sitting in somewhere with something like this sticking on it, because when you take it out, it's useless to you. It's impossible to do a good job if the tools you're working with aren't proper for what you're doing. There's different things for cleaning that roller. Here's a scraper. Comes with a curved piece that you can take to your paint pail and clean most of the paint out of the roller with. They're relatively inexpensive. If you're like me, you buy the paint you need, and sometimes you've painted all the room and you've only got about this much left in the pail, and you're worried about, have I got enough to do touch-ups and that? Take your roller with one of these, and you can clean a fair bit of paint out of the roller before you wash it. These will hold an ounce and a half of paint quite easily. Sometimes that's the difference of having to go and purchase another $40 or $50 can of paint so that you can use this much out of it to complete a touch-up. So, it's just a scraper. Yeah, and they... Pardon me? Yes. When I prime the wall, I'll sand it. I'll put a coat on it. When that's dry, I'll run a sander over it and then put the finish coat on. You'll find the finished product that you end up with is far superior. It's almost impossible. When I was doing houses, when I first started out, I would strain everything. Take an old pair of pantyhose, or they make filters. Pantyhose works the best. Stretch it over the 5-gallon pail and then pour another 5 through it. You'd be amazed at a brand new pail of paint at the sediments and little bits that haven't been stirred properly or shaken that come out of those sort of things. So the fewer particulate matters that you leave in the product you're doing, the better the outcome of your job. I find you can't filter things enough times when it comes to that thing. If you're doing a lot of it, if you're just doing a room where you're going to be tweaking and perfecting it, it isn't as bad, but a filter does help you. Especially if you've got a can that's been sitting for a while. Maybe you've done the room once and you're trying to do a recoat. Just make sure you strain it, because they'll skin over slightly on the top of the pail. You've been in there stirring once or twice before and you may not stirred everything up, and now you've got little chunks and bits and pieces. Or if you've cleaned your roller out and there happens to be a bit of something that came with it, it's a good idea to do. It's a practice that most painters you see will do with. Here's a roller that might pique your interest. I'll pass it around. If anyone can tell me what that's for. For trays, you can get all different types of them. They make plastic inserts. I think I saw one over there on top of the locker that fits into the industrial commercial size trays. This is one of the smaller ones that I use a lot of just because it's easy to carry around. If you're doing a lot of painting in different colors and you don't want to buy a whole bunch of trays, or you don't want to spend a whole bunch of time cleaning up, you buy the liners. You paint, you take the liner out, throw it away, put a new liner in your tray, and then put your color in it. I always just wash things out. It doesn't take that long for myself, but if you're inclined, you can just use the liners. Never leave a tray that you're going to just brush the paint around. I see a lot of guys that done that, and then the next day they'll go and pour the paint in the thing. You get skins off if they can. Anybody figure out what that's for? You're on the right path. Textured ceilings. If you're doing stipple, it's a sponge roller, and you'll notice that it's all little rings. It'll pop over top of all the little bumps and humps and stuff, and it holds a lot of paint. If you're using something like that, that brings me to this. Drop sheets. They are a little bit of money. They're not too terrible expensive. If you go to somewhere like the paint stores or Walmart and that, you can buy. Average homeowner, I always say, should own at least one good drop sheet. The rest, if you've got a bunch of old bed linens around that you don't use, or something that's been in the closet for 15 years, or in my case for that, 15 years, that you're never going to use, or an old blanket of some sort. A drop sheet for a homeowner, I always think a good one to buy is a hall runner. They're only this wide, they're a 4-foot width, but they're 12 to 14 feet long. So if you're painting along a wall, you can place that runner end to end against the wall, and you'll notice the materials on this paint drips on it. It can't go through it. You can use poly, but I find poly collects dust, and if you're moving poly around, as you walk, the dust sticks to the wall, and the bottom 2.5 to 3 feet, you'll get lint and stuff that static electricity picks up from the poly, whereas something like this doesn't. And then for the remainder of the room, if you happen to be doing something, take and put your drop sheets that you've got from an old bed linen or something. They're fine. You'll find though, if you do drop paint, like if you're doing a ceiling and you drip paint on a regular sheet, it will go through. But when you move the sheet away, take a sponge with a little bit of dish soap and water and just give it a quick wipe, and it takes it up. If it happens that you don't see it, I told you about goof off. That's a painter's best helper. It'll take paint off of just about anything. It's a pretty inexpensive product, but I do caution you, try it in an area like in a closet somewhere where you don't see, and just wipe it on quickly and just, you know, count to 20 or something and wipe it off and see if it does, because this will take paint right off of things. I've had tile floors that many previous painters had left speckles on, and you know, a lady would say they've done that project 10 years ago and they still left stuff on there, and it'll remove them. It's a good product for what it is. When you're sanding walls, to prep for your paint, I showed you my hand sander there, it's over there for now. We've used the sponges or a block sander. This has, if you're unsure and you're trying to get something dead level, it's a rigid block sander. It's fairly rigid. It lifts up, your sandpaper snaps in, and it gives you a good solid flat surface to do. If you don't want to buy something like this, a small wooden block that fits your hand. You can take the paper, fold it over, and then just put a couple of staples in each side, and you can get the same effect. You know, things like this are good tools to help you if you're not. I use something like this a lot, but you actually, after over time, you will get to know, you don't lead on it one way like that, sanding. And if you're trying to take a large object off a painted wall, take your razor knife and just shave it off first to get rid of the bulk of it, because what happens if you try sanding it off is you're also sanding the area outside of it, and you end up with a real shiny spot on a wall or some imperfections that take some time to finish. Different size brushes for different applications. If you're down along the edge of a piece of woodwork and you're trying to get in between two doors and there's a narrow, something like that size of a brush can be an asset to use. If you get good enough with a sash brush, you can get between things that are fairly small, but if you get a wild hair sticking out the edge of the brush that you're always trying to deal with, take a hold of that hair on the brush and just pull it off and throw it away. If it's something that as you keep washing and it sits out the side of the brush, it's nothing but a problem for you looking for a place to happen. You'll dip in the paint and you'll go down the edge of something, and this thing will be out here and drool paint on whatever you don't want it on. It doesn't matter how you hold it, it's always going to go on something you don't want. So you're laughing. So you've actually been down that road before, have you? You can get a lot of miles out of a brush if you pull just a few of the bristles out. It isn't going to impact it. The tools that I've dragged out here today are some of the tools that will help you. You don't necessarily have to buy everything that you see on the table. Pick and choose what you think you're going to get the most mileage out of. These are things that I've learned through the years to help get through some of these types of deals. If you take care of a good quality tool, it'll take care of you. And that's been preached to me most of my life. Good quality tools help any tradesperson leave a quality job. So if you're ever wondering about a person you've hired and that, if a guy wanders in with a big cigar and he's got a rag hanging out of his pocket and a bunch of beat up, bent up brushes and that, you might want to ask for some references or maybe an example of his work. If you see somebody who's got everything in a box and the brushes are clean and straight, they can look like these with paint all over the handles and that, but they don't necessarily have to block them like this. I do it because they sit for a long time. Tradesperson will carry either a box of brand new ones or they'll have a certain cup. You'll find once you get going, people get anal about how this brush I've used for years to cut in. It has the brushes flex a certain way. You can get different grades of brushes that are stiffer bristle. And once you start cutting in and learning how to handle a brush along a ceiling and that, you get a feel for it. You know, when you get into a corner, you kind of give it a little twitch and it pushes the bristles at the one end to get the paint just to go to the corner. Sometimes along a ceiling, if I'm having a problem along texture, I'll pop this up against the texture and then just paint along the edge rather than masking along the wall. If you're going to do something like that with a wide knife, you'll find you always have to carry a rag with you and wipe that edge before you move to the next one, because it'll have paint drooled along the edge and you'll drag it along. But if you're unsure of cutting in that, just put it against the texture so you're there and then come down the wall. I'll show you the technique up here after. Patching, when you're ready at this stage, you've got all the wall prep primed and you'll find there's a couple of defects in that wall. You're in a big panic, you got a show you want to go see or hockey game or what have you, and you've allotted this much time to get that wall done. You can fix that little patch, put a little bit of drywall mud on it, take your hair dryer out, just dry it quickly with it, and there again, put just enough of filler on to cover what you've missed. Sand it gently with your sanding sponge, a little bit of primer over it, or if you've already got your paint out to do your finish coat, just take your brush before you cut in, over to the patch, and brush a little bit on the patch just so that it doesn't flat. Because if you don't, the raw drywall does what we call flash. It ends up with a flat spot looking on the wall, the rest of it's got a sheen to the wall, and you'll see the patch every time. So if you just take and put a little bit of paint over top of it before you go to do the rest of the wall, work from, say, the other side of the room, or start from that point and go this way and around. When you get to that end, then you're covering that, and it won't show up on you as bad at all. By the time you put your second coat on, you won't even know where it is. Does anybody got any questions on what we've got here on the table today? Man, tough group. If you'd like, you can maybe grab a quick coffee or something if you'd like right away, and then we'll go to the wall and we'll put some paint on a wall. Ideally, I always say to people, take a corner where you can take a sample of it off, like at a closet, and take it to the paint store. It's to teach somebody how to identify an oil paint versus a latex. I can tell by looking at it, but it's tough to tell by the feel and the shine that's on it, is how I tell. Paint stores will be able to tell you immediately when they look at it. And there again, if you're going over oil, they'll give you a primer, then you can put your latex on it. If you put latex over an oil, you'll find it'll bubble off. You'll go to put the paint on, and you might get away with it the first time. But when you go to put the second coat on, you'll be rolling away, and then you'll come back and look down the wall and you'll see bubbles of it starting to lift. That's because the layer below has not adhered to the oil. You can make it adhere to it if you sand the daylights out of it with a reasonably coarse or a new piece of paper on your sander. It will bite, but it will release easy. I've seen whole walls where you can take a knife behind you and just all the paint comes off and just sheets, or you can just, and it's a terrible mess to clean up then. I've had it happen to me years ago when I, inexperienced and started on to things. Yeah. Any type of lacquer-based product, if you rub on it, just a little bit of it, it'll lift. Yeah.
So the latex?
Latex will stay. The oil base, it will soften the oil.
So what if you have latex and you put oil on top of that?
You're fine that direction. It's the other way. A lot of older homes were always painted in oil because everybody said, paint with oil, paint with oil. Kitchens and baths especially, any high moisture area. Environmental laws have changed so much in the last few years. Very, very few people can even purchase oil-based products. It's
Your feedback pretty good. You can put latex on oil base.
You can put oil on latex, but to put a latex on an oil, you need to put a primer on it, and not just a regular primer. Ask the people at the paint store and tell them that you're top coating over the oil. You're relatively certain that it's an oil-based product and that you're going to top coat it with latex. So they would give you the appropriate primer. I believe General Paint, Glidden, ICI, all of the major manufacturers make a proper primer for it. I don't know if Behr and them and their one coats, I don't know if they cover with it, I've never been sold on one coats.
Right, the ones that have primer in them, you wouldn't.
I am not 100% sold. I would ask somebody at a paint store for certain if that product will cover it and stay. You'll find the people at the paint store can save you a lot of headaches in the end. I can tell people all the different things that I've learned in my life, but they're the people that are working every day with it and are selling these products. So like I say, the plastic primers that I used to use from general paints maybe aren't as appropriate anymore. Maybe they've got better products than that. I haven't top coated any kind of oil probably in 10 years now. Very rarely anymore. Latex paints have come so far in the last 10 years that there's really no reason to put yourself in the environment where you're working with oil-based products. I've worked within them and had tears coming out my eyes from some of those products, and there's really no way that you should be putting yourself in that environment. There's certain products like lacquers and that are hard to work with that you can use on woodwork, and once you've learnt the process, it gives you a far superior finish. Excuse me. But they do make latex-based products that do the same jobs. We'll have a look at the wall here and see what kind of trouble we can get into there. Everybody needs a paint handle. One of the best products you'll ever buy is one of the short ones, because these are extendable. This is an older one, so you can do ceilings, or if you're in a short area, you just shorten them up. A piece of an old broomstick will do the same thing, but you've got to keep a couple of different lengths of it. These are relatively inexpensive now. I believe still under $25 to $30. Most homeowners should have something like this just to have in their corner with all of their painting stuff if you're going to do a lot of it yourself. It makes your job a lot easier. We primed everything. There's a few imperfections in the drywall that you'll see. At present, it doesn't look too bad. You'll find, though, lots of natural lights that shine through in the daytime. Mornings and evenings, as the sun's setting or rising, you'll notice more imperfections in your walls because the light is shining along the walls. The way we simulate something like that, I keep an old trouble light with a bulb, and you plug it in and you go on. If you happen to have an old lamp with a bulb, carry it along the wall. And if you hold it at a right angle to the wall when you're doing this, hold it up away from yourself, and you'll notice any imperfection along the wall. Right there you can see the two screws. If you come closer, there's two screws there that need to have a little more mud put in them. And if you go along the wall, oh, missed coating a couple of spots there. You can see that along the top. Right here and right here needs to have a little more mud put in it. And then you get to an area like this. The dough head that sanded the wall didn't sand that before he primed it. Now it's a bunch of added mud on the wall that he has to deal with because he purposely left that for you. But you were in a hurry when you sanded and you roared through and you put your primer on. The next day you go to have a look at it and you think, oh, that one's going to be trouble. So you'll have to take your hand sander and touch that area up. Right here there's a bit of a roller lap. It's a little bit of a where I primed it and I run the roller and you get a little bit of a mark there. You can sand those out. Here's where that patch was the other night. I think you said you wondered if it was the same wall. There's a little mark here that needs to be touched up. So this is where you would take your drywall knife and a little bit of patch, touch it up because it's so small a mark. Take your hair dryer. It only takes long. Don't hold it right on it because you can blister this. Just it only takes a few minutes till that it's dry enough. You can sand. You don't want to have a large buildup of your material on there. Just a skim, like I was showing you when you were spotting nails and that the other day. Just a light skim is all you need there. If you're in this area here, my hand sander. If you come and just actually put your hand along there, you can feel the coarseness on this. And if you run your hand along here, you'll actually feel the transition of where I've sanded and where there's not been sanding. I use a pole sander, which is a longer version to get to the high spots, but they're not for a homeowner most of the time. They make them in a round one. They have one here, I'll show you. But I find if you just go along the wall, and I run a hand behind myself all the time, and it's just like that. And you can feel if you've missed something, or if like on that leading edge, there's a bit. That's all you need. And that takes all of the little and it's really prevalent when you find areas like this where there's little bits and if you've rolled near the edge, you pick up the dust and that. You notice I've got drywall debris in here. If you run the roller over it, the nap of your roller goes in here, picks it up like this, and then it sticks it in the wall like that. Take your vacuum cleaner, your shop vac, just clean that out before you paint. Because this stuff here is awful to clean off of the wall after you got it. So the idea is to just kind of run the hand sander over, clean off any of the imperfections. When you get ones like this where the coarse line, now you've got a relatively smooth surface to take and start your painting. Corners, pick the square edge of your sponge sander. Now it's relatively smooth right into the corner. I like these little fold-out ladders. The simple fact they're fairly stable. They've got a wide stance. They fold up. And tuck away in a reasonably small footprint. There again, it's something that you may not ever use, but they are handy to use. I use a sawhorse. As you see, I got a little crazy with a skill saw one time. Need to be careful of things like that. Things like this area, you just touch them lightly. Normally, if it was my home, I would touch up any of these little areas that I showed you with the light, but for the sake of getting through things tonight, we'll turn a blind eye to that so that we didn't know those were there. So the first things you would do is you would paint your ceilings. Your ceilings are normally done in a flat white. Kitchens and baths, I like to use a satin or an eggshell. Bear in mind that they will show, the more higher the sheen on the paint, like a semi-gloss, will show any imperfection on your walls. Satin is a good one, and buy it if you're going to do it in your bathrooms or kitchens, kitchen and bath. Like I say, they put more emollients in it that are acceptable to high moisture environments. That's the purpose of those. The rest of your home is just a regular product. The walls, you always want to try and keep an eggshell finish or a satin on them as well. They're less prone to showing your imperfections.
So for any high humidity something?
Yeah, you can.
Because I really high humidity in my house.
Yeah. You'll find if yours was baseboard heat, right? Yes, and that's another problem of baseboard heat. Yeah. The humidity in homes can be a tough one to deal with. The paints and stuff for the kitchens and baths are a little more tolerant of those types of environments. It's a few more dollars, but it's probably in your best interest to put something like that product on your wall. Ceilings, I try and stick with flat. The kitchens and baths, I go to the satin finish simply because it's a little more tolerant, but in the rest of your home, just a flat finish. Makes it so nice, bright, easy to touch up. You'll find you can roll a coat on it in no time. It takes a little bit of finesse when you're rolling the ceiling. You try not to have roller marks. Roller marks are where you've run the roller with a little too much pressure on one side or the other, and it rolls a bead of paint off of the edge. Always try and run the longest strokes on the surface you're working with. Start at a wall where you're working out. Always take and roll the longest area you can reach. Nothing drives me crazier than someone that goes like this and like this. There's areas that you have to do that you can't get into, but always try and use the longest stroke on the roller that you're doing it with. Once you get to a certain point, you've rolled this area. When you start to roll this area, always go back onto your work and then take it out. So I always say 1/3, 2/3. So you go 2/3 of the way over, come back 1/3 of the way on, and then go across. You'll find that you can run the roller back and forth. You get a more consistent finish. You don't end up with looks like stripes on the wall almost. Some people find they'll run the roller until it's absolutely dry. And what happens is you end up with a dry flash on the wall. The paint is actually drying because you've rolled it so thin. The idea is to use enough product on the wall that your leading edge that you're always trying to stay touching into is always wet when you're going. Latexes aren't as bad as what oil used to be. Oils were horrible to do with. They would stay wet in that, but if you dry rolled it out, it would leave real predominant things that you could see in a wall. That's why I always say, try and go back to the third and then come back out. It takes a little more time and a little bit of finesse once you get onto the roller to the angle of where to run it at. I always find I run a little more pressure on this side almost just touches the wall as you're coming across. That way you don't end up with this side dropping a heavy line. And those are what I told you, sometimes can be hard to get rid of after if you've got a sand or run a razor up some of them if they get real bad. And it doesn't look nice on a wall when you look and you see this sort of a thing going down the wall. If it was something I was going to be using a little bit of and putting it away, sometimes I'll take and just poke a little hole along the rim on the inside so that if paint gets in it, it runs back into the can. Otherwise, when I pour it into the tray, you'll get a bit of a drool down the side of the container. Always try and clean that out a little bit so that it's not quite so bad. When you put just a nail and a hammer and just take and pop a little hole in it, and then whatever paint drools into the edge will actually run down into the can. You always want to dip the brush into the paint a little bit. I always tap it on the edge of the can just to knock any of the drips that are going to fall immediately off. And then when you're going to cut in, take the brush at a bit of a right angle. Yes, it's a sash brush. The first time you're cutting in for your first finish coat, you'll find there's a lot of little white lines and stuff show through. Don't worry about having to cover them all the first time. When you go around the next time and you sand, just gently sand, you'll find each time you sand there's a lot less drag on your sanding each time because the surface you've got is that much shinier and there's less product on there. Yes, I put the primer on here last night.
So you don't have to dust it, you just sand it and go?
I usually just brush it off with either a cloth or some people have used those dust bunny brushes and stuff. That helps as well. I find most of the time when I'm sanding, there's so very little stuff on there other than that white flash you see on your hand when you wipe it. It's one of those things where you can put it against the ceiling, go right into the corner. When you do that, it leaves you your straight edge. But you'll find you've got to be careful. You notice what happened there? There was a drool down the backside because I didn't wipe it. So you always end up having to take and wipe the edge because as soon as I touch the ceiling there, that's what I meant. By using these knives, it's a little more work. You have to carry a cloth with you and always wipe down the backside at least. That's why these pants have got paint on them. I used to be terrible for this. But then you can do this. And that's up against the ceiling. And that's a relatively straight line. Yeah. It's a bit of a time-consuming doing it this way, but it's a good way to cheat. It helps you run a straight line. Where I've cut, I haven't gone right up into the corner. I'll find sometimes I cheat and I'll stay back a little bit because the brush drags on the first coat. Second coat, then I can it'll float across better and it floats on it, then you can cheat that little bit back into the very edge. A wide knife like we just did there will allow you to get in tighter. And against texture, you'll find you'll have to hold it at more of an angle down and reach up, but be careful that you keep enough pressure on it that the bristles of the brush don't push back beyond it and onto the texture. Texture cutting against sometimes can be a problem because your brush will touch the little bits of stipple that stick down, and then you end up with drools down the wall from it. I found over my years, I'll take something like a key or something, and I run it against the wall and just remove the texture about this far out onto the ceiling. That way then it allows enough room for your brush to slip in behind the leading edge of the texture. And you'll never see that little reveal that you've made with a key or something there. The edge of your scraper might work if you're careful with it. Keep it at a slight angle out. So if you're in against the wall here, keep it at a slight angle out so that the texture's actually beveled this way to the wall. If the texture's been painted before, it could be a fairly tough piece to try and make that mark in. Excuse me. I've got onto the ceiling and a little lark here. What you can do after is take a little bit of your flat and a piece of your painter's tape once all of this is dried, and lay your painter's tape along the line that you're using. Just take your finger and run it along that edge so that the tape is stuck well, and then take your white ceiling paint, touch that area up just with a thin brush along that area, and then just take your painter's tape off, and it'll leave you a nice square edge for things. Be careful where you set paint, because if you hit the thing and knock it on the floor, you're going to have a heck of a mess. And if you've got carpet or something like that there, it can be a expensive fix to clean up. All the goo be gone and goof off, and that in the world won't take it out of the carpets. Cutting in is a control thing with a brush. It comes with time. A lot of people have trouble with it. If your hand's a little unshaky or something, lay your other hand behind you. What I've done is take a small ball and put on a stick. You put the stick against the wall. Painters used to do it for years in pinstripe shops. They lay it against the wall, and then you have your hand on it here. You support the wrist, and then just use the strokes across with the brush. A ruler with a piece of something soft on the end of a tape, and then just you lay it against the wall, your extra painter's stick. You can lay it like this, set your hand against it. I find a longer one works better, that you can set at a larger angle. I find if you support your arm here. And if you're like me and wear bifocals, sometimes working like this up tight, you have an awful time with glasses. You're doing this. I find that can be a troublesome time too. Find yourself a set of readers or something of the same prescription you use and wear them so that you actually get a steady vision on it. If you're trying to get paint to flow into something like that corner, you can take your brush and that's where a sash brush with that fine point. If you're trying to get the paint to go up into that, just the corner, just kind of work the brush and flex the ends of it, and you'll see it lays up there quite nicely. A lot of the finessing of the brush and that comes with just practicing. Find yourself a couple of scrap pieces, something that you want to try it on. Say you're trying to work into a corner like over here, up in there, and you just work the brush so that you can see how that point sets out, and you can just jiggle the brush and the point flares open. So if you set that so that it's right in the corner, and then just give it a little jiggle and then draw it down, it'll flare out enough that it'll cover in that corner. Those are some of the hardest areas for people. Sometimes you're trying to get into there, and that's where I say a sash brush actually is the best product you can ever use for painting. It's easier to control, and the other brushes have their place, like I say, if you're doing large flat work on siding and such. So there we've got around the edge of the building. If you've got your receptacles in and that, you can always take your brush and you go around them. There's nothing worse than saying, oh, I got that, I've done this 1,000 times, and you're running around with a roller, and all of a sudden you go bloop, and you're about this far up on a receptacle, so now you're trying to clean that off so it doesn't look like an amateur had at it. So, and always bear in mind your covers are going to be out here, so you don't have to get in that far in. I just find sometimes if you have to adjust the covers around a little bit and that, sometimes you maybe don't catch enough of the areas. So I always try and cover those areas off. And obstacles like this. You don't have to be as fussy with things like this if they're being covered with escutcheons. Escutcheons are a chrome ring that has the hole in it that you can slip over there. I always like to paint behind it just as a protection for the material against moisture and that. So. And it doesn't take an awful lot of material just to go around all of those. And then you get your roller. If you don't have your baseboards on yet, you can run the roller along on the flat. I'll show you along the bottom here. You don't have to cut in along the bottom. If you've got your drop sheet down and you're getting started, you can dip your roller I always find, make certain that you've picked up enough material on the roller. Usually the first time takes a little bit, but if you're using your poly on the floor, the roller run out of paint fairly quickly there, so you'll notice it starts to run dry. Make certain you've got lots of material on your paint on the rollers so that it's now you've got a large edge that you don't have to come down near the floor. When you're starting at the edge of the wall and near the corner, don't stick the roller right in, because you'll notice when you run the roller the first time, there's a heavy bead that's down the edge of it, of paint. If you start in too close, it's hard to get that without getting onto the other wall. So I always try and stay out that little bit, run it up and down a couple of times just to disperse the paint, and then slowly work it in. And you can stay roughly an inch away from the other wall. When you cut it the next time, it will cover in. And I don't mind going to about there. I can feel the roller starting to run out of paint. Don't keep going, because then you'll have a dry edge, like if you run the roller right out of material. And there again, go right to the ceiling and right to the floor. You'll get a better looking finish out of this running up and down in one fluid motion like that. And there again, you can feel when the roller starts to run out of material. Oh, well, once you get it home and that, you'll get to go at it yourself. Sometimes if you get areas like this so that I don't go picking up garbage off of there, I know my casing's going to cover a certain amount there. I'll just take and turn it sideways and then cover that area off. Then you've got a full foot that you can work with back and forth. This is a part of a job I always enjoyed. It was painting. I find the most satisfaction because when you get people come into your home and they take a look at it, and it's a job that you feel good about because it didn't cost you an awful lot. Once you've purchased a few of the basic tools, just knowing how to apply the product, you can get a lot of self-satisfaction out of that. And it isn't really tough. Once you get used to it and you're used to the tools that you're using, the finished product can be every bit as good as a professional coming in and doing it, and you've done it yourself. Overnight.
Overnight?
Yeah.
And you sand it again and put it sand.
Yes.
And that's even with the ones that have the built-in primer? Like all the paint that I've gotten so far for the house,
Yeah.
I bought it ahead of time, it's all built-in primer with it, so.
Yeah, and I've always sanded between coats. I had the fortune of a father-in-law who was a journeyman painter who came from Denmark. In Denmark, it's a 5-year apprenticeship to be a painter. But they teach you how to do commercial vinyl, wallpapers, and such like that. Wallpapers are a job that I've done. I don't particularly like because it can be a royal pain. It can look very nice when it's done. My history is commercial vinyls in office spaces. Residential vinyls, I've done some of, but I find most of them aren't like wallpapers of years ago that were reasonably heavy product and easy to work with. I find that the wallpapers nowadays are a thinner product. They're harder to cut. It's a lot harder to do a nice job with some of them. You're better off to hire somebody that does a lot of wallpapers. You can do it yourself, but to line up patterns and to know how much you can cheat and cut, you can make a heck of a mess of product in that. There are some that are very easy to use, but anything with a pattern makes it tougher. You know, there's... Pardon? Yeah, you can have very good luck with it, or you can have terrible luck with it. I know Craftsman still does. I have a brother-in-law that still does a little bit. He was trained by his father. They're people that have worked with many different types of vinyls. And
What about paintable wool?
you've always got a seam wherever the paper's joined. So once you paint it, it's something that you're still going to see those seams. It's not like a drywall finish that you're going to have a nice, even, flat surface across. And you'll find a lot of wallpapers, the real good ones, they joined and overlapped, and then the tradesman would take a knife and cut down them, and the joint would be butted. So there wasn't an overlap, so all you would have is that very thin seam.
Just with my Latin plaster wall, I bought some wallpaper that you could paint,
Yeah,
thinking that some spots, I might try that. I might have the wall available.
you'll find wallpapers are probably a good pick on lath and plaster sometimes because they don't have predominantly shiny sheens on the surface. So lath and plaster was put on by a trowel, and you're at the mercy of the person applying the plaster Paris that goes over the lath and plaster. So however steady he was with that hand trowel, applying it is as good a surface as you're going to get. You can patch them and touch them up with drywall products, but it's very hard to make a nice finish on lath and plaster. The nature of the product, it's so hard, and when you try and sand drywall products around it, it's hard to explain. When you run the sanding onto the lath and plaster, it just skates. And as soon as you hit the lath or the drywall texture, it digs in. So it's hard to feather edges. You have to run very, very lightly along the edges and such.
What's the easiest way to take off wall? Like borders?
They make a product that the paint store sells. It's kind of like a CLR product. You add water to it, and you can spray it on the wall or brush it onto the product, let it sit, and then you take a broad scraper knife or drywall knife and you can peel it off.
Maybe a quick easy. I know this because my house is all like 7 layers of wall.
They do make a steamer that you can use as well, but I don't know of anyone around here. I've used the steamers years ago, it actually fit on a vacuum at that time. And you put boiling water in a glass jar that was attached to it, and you used the exhaust end of the vacuum and it sprayed it onto the wall, and it would remove it. But ideally, any kind of if you bought a cheap garden sprayer with a hand pump, just one of those little green ones, and go to your paint store, they'll have a product that you can stir up and mix with hot water in it. Spray it on, and it'll give you a time. And a lot of the time you leave it is dependent on the quality of the paper that's on it. A cheaper paper will absorb the material and loosen the glue quicker. Some of the more expensive wallpapers, especially anything that's got like a foil or that to it, will take a considerable lot longer time to finish off.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was 7 layers of wallpaper over top of each other. And so I used the liquid greasy with this paper. And like it worked really good. But it was not easy. Toward the end when I went to go paint, I didn't get all the glue and started off. And by then I just said, oh well. Because my arm, like it took probably 2 weeks working on the glue. But 7 layers.
So that kind of gives you an idea of how to use these tools for this type of a job. Textured ceilings, that foam roller, like I say, it's probably your best bet for doing stuff like ceilings. If you're not going to use something like a foam roller, you've got a very heavy shag roller because you need a lot of paint on your roller, and it can be very messy. The foam roller, I find, is not near as bad, but you've got to protect the surfaces below. What I usually do is buy a roll of that very thin poly and then mask it along the walls, about this far down from the ceiling. Then you can paint your ceiling, and if you happen, because what happens is the roller picks bits and pieces of the texture off in it and it just flips it out all over the place. So wear a pair of safety glasses. If you're worried about your hair in that, put like a head net or something over to keep your hair in that covered, and don't worry about the clothes because they're going to come out looking like this.
So those like popcorn type ceilings that are from like the beautiful 90s.
70s.
You know, like the one where you touch it and all falls down.
Yeah.
Can you paint over that?
You can if you take, and what I would do is just get an airless sprayer, and you buy the cheapest 5-gallon pail of flat latex that you can get and spray it. That way, because as soon as you touch it with the roller, like you say, it's all going to come down in your face. So ideally, run your poly around the top, keep it about that far down, spray it with an airless sprayer with a fine tip. Then you can take the poly down, recut around the edges, and paint your walls, and it'll be fine. If it's got staining, like I had said last week, a product like Kills or a spray lacquer of some sort to seal the stains, you'll find a lot of those old textures have yellowed if it's been in a place where somebody has smoked. You've got to do the whole ceiling with something like Kills first, because the yellow stains from nicotine will always come out. That's one thing about cigarette smoke. You have to top coat it with something to seal it. If you have any indication that you think that's what you're trying to cover, tell the people at the paint store before you go and waste your time. It'll be fresher with a coat of paint on it, but it will bleed through. It's one of the nasty things with cigarettes and nicotine.
Say if you didn't have the stipple ceiling and it was still in a place that someone smoked, would TSP?
TSP is the product that you should wash it down with. TSP is the same product you can use on wallpaper removal as well.
I know you get paint that has a suede finish.
Mm-hmm.
What other techniques do you use for that? Can you use the regular roller techniques, or is there special techniques
For painting over a sprayed finish?
No, spray paints. They've got like almost a very fine sandpaper texture if you touch them.
I'd have to see the product in that to know for sure.
Did you like to do you like to paint?
Okay, it's like the crinkle finish that they spray?
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, it's like if you touch it, it's like never old cylinder walls you used to get, you touch the walls, like almost like a gritty feel.
Yes.
That type of paint.
It's like a speckle paint?
Yeah, just fine. Yeah.
Okay. You can coat that with drywall mud to level it, but it's very hard to get perfectly flat. Ideally, you can sand it, but you'll never get it true. So the drywall mud over top of it is probably your best bet, and then sand in large strokes up and down. Don't sand in one area all the time. And apply it with a wide knife like I showed you there, but in very thin layers.
Yeah, just you.
Yeah, and you should be able to cover it and come out with a reasonably flat surface. Don't paint it with anything with a higher sheen than an eggshell, because it will show the little imperfections, but you'll get a pretty reasonable finish out of it with a satin or eggshell finish on it.
If it's like a dark color, like a maroon or something, like some people do paint that. How much layers of undercoat should you paint before you can paint a lighter coat over?
The first coat and that you put over it, you should let dry well for a day or two, because it's going to have absorbed a lot of moisture because you're covering a surface that's all drywall mud.
Yeah.
So give it a couple of days to dry, and then you can put your next coat over it then. And you should have as good a finish as what we have here.
I have a question. When you paint paneling,
Yeah.
to fill in the grooves, you use drywall mud, right?
I use a spackle product that's a little harder.
Spackle product?
Yeah, something that's a little harder. Drywall mud, you'll find, you can do it if you're very gentle on the sanding, but it'll show. Spackle is a little harder product, and there again, apply it with your knife and don't leave a lot extra, because it is a little tougher to sand.
Okay.
And because you're on a hard surface, that little groove that you're going over, span it. Don't go up and down with it, because you'll find you'll sand the product out of the groove. And there again, my regular hand sander is a better one to use on something like that.
Okay, and
Be-
then for the glossiness, I just use regular flat paint.
Yeah, if you're going over a paneling, a lot of it will have like a sprayed lacquer finish or something to it. Use a primer that's, tell the people at the lumberyard or the paint store what you're covering, and they will give you an appropriate primer for that. There again, there's many products out there from all of the different people that supply those products, and they'll be able to direct you on that.
Okay.
Over the years, I've had good luck with sanding it
Yeah.
first before you put, like sanding it with a reasonably new piece of paper and take that shininess off of it, and then priming it once you've patched all of the seams in it,
Right.
and it will look reasonably decent.
So you sand it and then fill the mud. Sand
Yeah.
it.
And then sand that again once you put the mud to it.
Okay. And then paint it with flat paint, regular paint.
Just your regular eggshell or satin finish.
Okay.
So if you're going from like a dark wall color and you're gonna change the color to a lighter wall color,
Ideally, if you prime it, you'll find colors like greens, reds, and blues are very hard to cover. Tint your primer half color to what you're going to put for a finish color, and then run a coat of primer over it. Your next coats will cover a lot better. I find too, if you're doing whole rooms and it's all new drywall, I have the primer tinted to half color. That way too, it helps on your finish coats because you've got a base of the color in there.
So both priming? both
Like,
priming?
if you're gonna do a whole room and you're gonna buy primer, have them tint the primer with half the color of your finished product.
So both coats are tinted?
Then they're all tinted,
Okay.
your finish coat and your primer. It helps with the coverage. Most primers are fairly transparent. You can, in fact, some of them, once they dry, you can hardly see. We used to use a commercial CIL product. It was very, very good at sealing the walls, but you could see right through it. And sometimes took a third coat to cover a wall. So that's when we started tinting the primers, because it covers better.